There's a mental habit most people repeat every single day. Edgar Cayce warned it quietly shapes the outcome of their lives. Highly sensitive people are vanishing from public life at rates psychologists can't ignore. They're leaving jobs, relationships, cities disappearing into silence. And scientists are now seeing patterns in the data that suggest this isn't random withdrawal. It's something closer to biological survival. If you're still here, subscribe now, you'll want to see where this goes. Edgar Cayce predicted this nearly a century ago, long before neuroscience confirmed what he described, that certain people absorb the emotional frequencies of the world around them with such intensity that modern society becomes physically unbearable. He called them the sensitives. Today, researchers call them HSPs, highly sensitive persons, and they make up roughly 20% of the population. But in the last decade, something has shifted. They're not just struggling. They're systematically removing themselves from the systems most people take for granted. Workplaces, crowded cities, even digital spaces. And the question no one's asking is whether they're leaving by choice or being pushed out by forces we're only beginning to measure. Cayce's readings described sensitivity not as a flaw, but as a form of heightened receptivity to energetic imbalances in the environment. He claimed these individuals acted as barometers for collective stress, absorbing tension the way certain materials absorb radiation. For decades, this sounded like metaphysical speculation. Then neuroimaging studies began mapping the brains of highly sensitive people. What they found was unsettling. HSPs process sensory information through deeper neural pathways, particularly in regions tied to empathy, awareness, and emotional regulation. Their brains don't filter stimuli the same way. They take in more, feel more, and when the environment becomes chaotic, their nervous systems react as though under siege. The data shows they're not imagining it. Their bodies are registering real, measurable overload. And in the world we've built, one of constant noise, artificial light, digital saturation, and social fragmentation, that overload has become continuous. But here's the first contradiction. Sensitivity, according to evolutionary biologists, should be an advantage. HSPs are better at detecting danger, reading social cues, noticing subtle changes in their These are survival traits. So why, in a world that demands awareness and adaptability, are they the ones collapsing first? The answer, Cayce suggested, is that modern life isn't designed for survival. It's designed for stimulation. And stimulation, at the levels we've normalized, short-circuits the very systems that make sensitive people effective. They don't adapt to chaos. They register it as threat. And when threat becomes ambient, the body doesn't fight, it retreats. Psychologists have documented this withdrawal in clinical terms. HSPs report higher rates of burnout, chronic fatigue, autoimmune flare-ups, and social isolation. They describe feeling like they're constantly holding the emotions of everyone around them, even strangers. Cayce called this psychic porosity, the inability to maintain energetic boundaries in environments saturated with emotional noise. Modern psychology has a different term: empathic distress. But the mechanism is the same. The sensitive person becomes a sponge. And when the sponge is full, it can't function. It shuts down. Then came the second contradiction. If HSPs are so overwhelmed, why aren't we seeing mass advocacy, support systems, or cultural recognition? Why are they disappearing quietly, almost invisibly? The answer lies in how sensitivity is perceived. In a culture that rewards resilience, productivity, and emotional control, sensitivity reads as weakness. Accese pensare, toughen up, stop overthinking, get out of their heads. They're pathologized, medicated, or dismissed. And because they internalize criticism more deeply than others, they begin to believe the problem is them, not the environment, not the pace, not the noise. Them. So they don't demand change. They remove themselves. They quit jobs without explanation. They stop answering calls. They move to remote areas, delete social media, and build lives on the margins. It's not depression. It's not antisocial behavior. It's self-preservation in a system that doesn't accommodate their operating system. Cayce described this phenomena as a soul-level mismatch. He claimed highly sensitive individuals were incarnated with nervous systems, calibrated for a different kind of world. One, slower, quieter, more attuned to natural rhythms. He predicted that as technology accelerated and human connection fragmented, these individuals would begin to malfunction, not because they were broken, but because the frequency of the environment had shifted beyond their tolerance range. And he warned that when enough of them withdrew, society would lose something critical: its emotional conscience. The people who feel too much are also the ones who care too much. They're the teachers who stay late, the friends who listen, the artists who translate pain into meaning. When they disappear, so does a certain quality of presence, a certain depth, and that absence, Cayce said, would go unnoticed until it was too late. Neuroscientists studying HSPs have found something even stranger. Sensitivity isn't static. It can intensify under prolonged stress. The more chaos a sensitive person absorbs, the more sensitive they become. It's a feedback loop. Their brains begin hyper-responding to stimuli that wouldn't register for others. A sharp tone of voice, fluorescent lighting, the hum of a refrigerator. What used to be manageable becomes unbearable, and because this escalation happens gradually, they often don't recognize it as environmental injury. They think they're losing their minds. They seek therapy, medications, diagnoses. But the real issue isn't neurochemical, it's ecological. Their system is reacting accurately to an environment that's genuinely hostile to their wiring. Here's the third contradiction. The world claims to value mental health, emotional intelligence, and authentic connection, all things HSPs naturally embody. Yet the structures we've built punish those exact traits. Open-plan offices, 24-hour connectivity, performative social media, transactional relationships, every system optimized for speed and output, not depth or recovery. Cayce foresaw this tension. He said the sensitives would be the first casualties of a world obsessed with doing, not being. And he was right. HSPs don't thrive in productivity culture. They can't commodify their inner lives. They can't pretend nuance doesn't matter. So they're filtered out, not by polykey, but by exhaustion. Then there's the data no one talks about. Longitudinal studies tracking HSPs over decades reveal something unsettling. Many of them simply vanish from follow-up research. They mob off-grid, disconnect from institutions, stop participating in the systems researchers use to track populations. This isn't dropout, it's erasure. And it's happening at a scale large enough that some psychologists have started asking whether we're witnessing the beginning of a quiet, evolutionary split, a subset of humanity opting out of modernity altogether, not through ideology, but through nervous system collapse. Cayce's readings spoke of a future where two kinds of people would emerge, those who adapted to mechanization and those who couldn't. He didn't frame this as superiority or inferiority, he framed it as divergence. And he suggested that the sensitives, if they survived, would become the architects of a slower, more intentional world, one built on presence rather than productivity. But survival, he warned, would require them to reject the premise that their sensitivity was the problem. It would require them to stop trying to fix themselves and start questioning the systems demanding their adaptation. Modern psychology is beginning to reach the same conclusion. Therapists working with HSPs are shifting language. They're no longer treating sensitivity as a disorder to manage. They're framing it as a mismatch between organism and environment. The intervention isn't fixing the person, it's redesigning the environment. Noise-canceling headphones, remote work, reduced social obligations, boundaries that would be considered extreme for others but are baseline survival for HSPs. And when those accommodations are made, something remarkable happens. The sensitivity doesn't disappear, but the distress does. The person stabilizes, functions, thrives, even, which suggests the issue was never the sensitivity itself. It was the environment's refusal to make room for it. But here's the deeper layer. What if the withdrawal of highly sensitive people isn't a crisis? It's a signal. Cayce believes sensitives were early warning systems for collective imbalance. When they start collapsing en masse, it means the environment has become toxic not just for them, but for everyone. They're just the first to feel it. The canaries in the coal mine, and their disappearance might be the loudest message we're ignoring, that the way we're living isn't sustainable for any nervous system, sensitive or not. We've just normalized the damage for everyone else. Researchers studying societal collapse have identified a pattern. The first populations to destabilize are always the most sensitive to environmental stress. In ecosystems, it's the amphibians. In societies, and history shows that when these populations begin to vanish, larger system failure follows. Not immediately, but inevitably, because the sensitives aren't peripheral. They're woven into the fabric of care, creativity, and connection that holds communities together. When they withdraw, the social structure doesn't collapse. It hollows, becomes functional but lifeless. And most people don't notice until they realize they're surrounded by transactions, not relationships. Efficiency, not meaning. Noise, not presence. Cayce's final warning about the sensitives was this: their disappearance wouldn't be dramatic. There would be no movement, no manifesto, no collective voice. They would simply fade into the margins, one by one, until the world looked around and realized something essential was missing. And by then, he said, it would take generations to rebuild what was lost. Not because the sensitives were gone, but because the world had forgotten how to value the qualities they carried: depth, nuance, the ability to feel what others couldn't name, the willingness to care when caring had become inconvenient. Today, psychologists report that HSPs are among the loneliest demographics in modern society, not because they lack relationships, but because they lack the kind of depth those relationships require to feel real. Surface-level interaction exhausts them. Small talk feels like static, and the friendships that used to sustain them, the long conversations, the unrushed presence, the mutual witnessing, have been replaced by texts, likes, and logistics. Cayce described this as soul starvation. The body can survive on shallow connection, but the sensitive soul can't. It needs resonance, and when resonance becomes rare, the soul begins to shut down. Not through choice, through deprivation. There's a study most people don't know about. Researchers tracked HSPs living in cities versus rural areas over 10 years. The urban HSPs showed accelerated aging markers, cellular stress, inflammation, shortened telomeres. The rural HSPs showed the opposite. Slower aging, better health outcomes, longer lifespans. The variable wasn't diet, exercise, or genetics. It was environmental pace. The urban sensitives were aging faster because their bodies were in constant defense mode. The rural sensitives were thriving because they'd removed themselves from the frequency that was killing them. It wasn't mindset. It wasn't resilience. It was biology, reacting to environment. And the data was so clear that some researchers began quietly advising HSP clients to consider relocation, not therapy, as the primary intervention. Cayce would have called this vibrational medicine. Modern science calls it environmental health, but the principle is the same. The body is not separate from its surroundings. It's in constant conversation with them, and for highly sensitive people, that conversation has become hostile. The lighting is too bright. The sounds are too sharp. The pace is too fast. The expectations are too relentless, and because they can't turn off their receptivity, they can't stop registering the dissonance, so they leap. Not because they're weak, because they're accurate. But here's what almost no one talks about. The sensitives who stay, the ones who don't withdraw, often pay a different price. They become hyperfunctional, overgivers, people-pleasers, burnout machines. They learn to override their own signals, numb their awareness, push through the overload, and they look fine until they don't. Until the body forces the shutdown, they refuse to choose. Chronic illness, breakdown, collapse. Cayce described this as the soul's rebellion against misalignment. The conscious mind can lie, but the body doesn't. And when a sensitive person ignores their limits long enough, the body takes control and imposes the boundaries they wouldn't set themselves. Psychologists have a name for this now. High-functioning sensitivity. It's the HSP who succeeds in conventional terms: career, relationships, social standing, but feels like they're dying inside. They've learned to perform normalcy so well that no one suspects the cost. And because they're good at hiding it, they're often held up as proof that sensitivity isn't real, or that it can be overcome. But the data tells a different story. High-functioning HSPs have some of the highest rates of autoimmune disease, anxiety disorders, and early mortality. They're not thriving. They're surviving on borrowed time, using willpower to compensate for a nervous system in chronic distress. And the tragedies, Cayce warned, is that most of them will never realize they didn't have to live that way. There's another pattern emerging. HSPs are increasingly drawn to alternative lifestyles that mainstream culture dismisses as escapist or privileged. Off-grid living, minimalism, digital detox, slow living. These aren't trends for them. They're survival strategies, and the fact that these choices are framed as luxury rather than necessity reveals how deeply we've normalized environments that are hostile to human sensitivity. The idea that someone would need to leave modern life to feel okay is treated as weakness. But what if it's clarity? What if the sensitives are simply the first ones to recognize that we've built a world incompatible with our own biology? Cayce believed the sensitives would eventually form their own communities, not through ideology, but through instinct. They would gravitate toward each other, create spaces that honored slower rhythms, and build microcultures where depth was valued over speed. And we're starting to see it. Online forums where HSPs find each other. Intentional communities forming around shared values. Co-housing projects designed for people who need quiet. These aren't utopian fantasies. They're practical responses to a world that won't accommodate them. And they're growing quietly. Invisibly to most. But growing. The question Cayce left unanswered was this: what happens to a society that loses its sensitives? What happens when the people who feel too much, care too much, and notice too much stop participating? He suggested the world would become efficient, fast, and cold. That technology would advance, but humanity would atrophy. That we'd build incredible systems, but lose the ability to connect through them. And he warned that the absence of the sensitives would go unnoticed until it was irreversible. Not because they mattered more than others, but because they carried something no algorithm could replicate. Presence, conscience, the capacity to feel what was happening beneath the surface. And maybe that's already happening. Maybe we're already living in the early stages of what Cayce foresaw, a world where people are more connected than ever but lonelier, more informed but less wise, more productive but less alive. And maybe the disappearance of highly sensitive people isn't a symptom of their failure to adapt. Maybe it's a warning that the rest of us are adapting to something we shouldn't. So when a highly sensitive person tells you they can't do this anymore, can't handle the noise, the pace, the shallowness, maybe the response isn't to tell them to try harder. Maybe it's to ask what they're sensing that the rest of us have learned to ignore. Because if Cayce was right, they're not the ones struggling to survive modern life. They're the ones still feeling it.